Beans are a super interesting ingredient to look at in the time frame of the 18th century because they're becoming very prolific. They're almost into the height of what beans become, but we're not quite there yet. And so we're seeing how people are experimenting with them, and we're seeing all the possibilities that they will change into in the future. One of the neatest things about looking at food and kind of seeing what it's doing in history is to pay attention to a particular recipe or a particular ingredient and watch the world change around it over time. That's what this episode is about, and it's one of the most enlightening things that we can see when we're looking at historical food. So baked beans in particular, that is the new thing that we're gonna cover in this episode. So it's a really strange topic to look into because there are very few facts that you can look up and say, I know this because of a primary source. But there's a lot of maybe it's fact because it's been handed down and it just actually did happen. There's this story that baked beans were handed down from indigenous people here in North America to Europeans when they came over. And they taught them how to make baked beans by putting beans in an earthen pot in the ground with bear grease and baking them, right? With a fire over top of them. The problem is that no matter what I do, I cannot find that as a primary source. I cannot find a journal where somebody's recorded, hey, I ran into this Native American and they taught me how to do this. Like, I cannot find that anywhere. And so one of the problems that we have as food historians or historians in general is that we hear the legends of things and we want those legends to be true, but we cannot tell for sure if they are. Maybe in the comments section, you guys can give me some insight if you know where a primary source that talks about this is, but I can't find it. And so it's really frustrating because it's such a cool story and it's a story that everybody knows. I have a responsibility to you, the audience, that I'm not supposed to just take something that I've heard from somebody that's been passed down over time and give it off to you as fact. In the Northeast, they will probably swear to that legend and they probably have something to support it up there that I can't find here. So if you're in the comments section, please let me know. But that is where we start with this. The first written recipe that we have for baked beans comes from 1829, but before that, we have the precursor and we see where this is coming from, because really at the end of the day, baked beans are kind of like a pudding, and we have boiled puddings before that. Now in our time period, people are treating peas and beans very similarly. There's not a whole lot of distinction. There's kind of some crossover. Now, if I do a video and I use black-eyed peas, people will say those are beans, they're not peas. But in the time period, that is not how people thought. It was beans and peas are very similar and they're used in very much the same way. So boiled puddings are very popular throughout the 18th century and peas pudding is one of the most popular. So we see peas pudding as a precursor to what happens with baked beans. Now, boiled puddings start to kind of gravitate towards just being baked puddings, and baked puddings are essentially what baked beans are. So by 1829, we see the first baked beans recipe. This comes from The Frugal Housewife by Lydia Marie Child, and it's an interesting cookbook because frugality was her main focus. So this was about economy. This cookbook is using as few ingredients as possible, and it's making the most simple dishes that are still wholesome for the family, and that was the whole point of it. And it sold so many copies and it had so many reprints. It's a very successful cookbook and people really, really love this. She is from Boston, but this is not where the term Boston baked beans is coming from yet, or at least it's where it's coming from, but it's not mentioned yet. They're not known as Boston baked beans at this time. We'll get to that later. Baked beans and peas. Baked beans are a very simple dish, yet few cook them well. They should be put in cold water and hung over the fire the night before they are baked. In the morning, they should be put in a colander and rinsed 2 or 3 times, then again placed in the kettle with the pork you intend to bake covered with the water and kept scalding hot an hour or more. A pound of pork is quite enough for a quart of beans, and that is a large dinner for a common family. The rind of the pork should be slashed. Pieces of the pork, alternately fat and lean, are the most suitable. The cheeks are best. A little pepper sprinkled over the beans when they are placed in the bean pot will render them less unhealthy. They should be just covered with water when put into the oven, and the pork should be sunk a little below the surface of the beans. Bake 3 or 4 hours. Now, before you can even start on this dish, and it's funny because this comes up in English writing later on. So over in Europe, they're not really making beans a whole lot. And so when they have the desire for baked beans and they ask their cooks to make them, there are different circumstances where the cooks didn't know that the beans had to be soaked. And so they had these like pea gravel hard beans that they baked, and then they were just unedible in the mess. So you have to soak your beans. And so overnight, if you're gonna make this at home, just go ahead and take your beans, put them in a bowl or a Ziploc bag or something like that with at least twice as much water as the amount of beans, and they're gonna soak and they're gonna swell up overnight. Then after you do that, then you need to do what we're doing now, and that's put the beans in water over the fire and let them kind of just warm up and heat up, and that's gonna open up the skin a little bit so that they're not hard. As far as putting this recipe together, it's super simple. After your beans are soaked and you've cooked them for a little while, you're gonna take your beans out and you're gonna put them in a sieve, get all the water out of there, and you're gonna put them into your bean pot. Now, when you put them into your bean pot, make sure to get plenty of black pepper in there, because that is the distinguishing factor of this recipe versus pretty much any other baked bean recipe that I've come across. This one really leans into the savory and it wants a lot of black pepper. At that point, you're gonna take your pork now and you're gonna alternate some pork pieces that have fat and lean. Now, it doesn't tell us how big of pieces it wants. Later on, as baked beans progress, it seems like there's like really big chunks of pork in there, and I don't think that that's what they're calling for in this particular recipe. So just make sure to chop those up, alternate them, use about 1 pound of pork to 1 quart of beans, and then fill them up with water so that the beans are just covered, and you want the pork to be submerged underneath the beans. Now there's a second recipe that I want to do, because baked beans don't really change now for the foreseeable future until the 1850s, and around that time period, that's when you start to see sugar or sweeteners of some kind come into play. And that is what turns into the baked beans that we think of now when we think of something like Boston baked beans, and that's exactly what the second recipe is called. So it's really interesting that, yeah, the first recipe where it was written, it came from a cookbook that was written by a Bostonian. And now, like 20 years later, a recipe comes out that adds the addition of sweetener, and it's called Boston baked beans. And we still call them Boston baked beans to this day. Although a bunch of New Englanders in the comment section are probably gonna say something like, well, they're not from Boston, they're from here. You guys can have that argument. I know that it's a big tradition for you guys and you really love your baked beans up in New England. This recipe is from The Improved Housewife by A.L. Webster, and it's funny, if you look at the title page, it just says by a married woman. Boston baked beans. Take 2 quarts of middling sized white beans, 3 pounds of salt pork, and 1 spoonful of molasses. Pick the beans over carefully. Wash and turn about 1 gallon of soft water to them in a pot. Let them soak in it lukewarm overnight. Set them in the morning where they will boil till the skin is very tender and about to break, adding a teaspoonful of saleratus. Take them up dry, put them in your dish, stir in the molasses, gash the pork, and put it down in the dish so as to have the beans cover all but the upper surface. Turn in cold water till the top is just covered. Bake and let the beans remain in the oven all night. Notice that this recipe calls for a little bit more pork than the last one, so we're gonna use 1 quart of beans to 1.5 pounds of pork. Now the saleratus is baking soda. I really don't know what they were expecting that to do, and I don't think it's necessary now, but we're gonna include it because they included this. Now this is where you get to decide how much molasses you want, because a spoonful is just one of those terms that doesn't help us really whatsoever. They might as well have said put a little bit of molasses or a lot of molasses or put some molasses, because that's what you're going to do. You're going to judge it based on how much molasses you want in your beans. And that's really all we have to do with this recipe. It's super simple, but it's super delicious. So both of these dishes can bake for the same amount of time. Now, one of them might have a time in the recipe, one of them just says put it in the oven overnight. It doesn't really matter. The longer you bake this thing, the better it is. So I put both of these in the oven at 300 degrees, and they were both in there for 7 or 8 hours. The earlier recipe is here. The later recipe is here. Let's give them a try. I've never been a big fan of molasses beans anyways, but I've never had them, you know, like this. This is gonna be better, I know that. It's better than out of a can. Now, I am a big fan of peppers, so let's see what happens here. This has 0 salt and it doesn't need it. It's so good. The pepper comes through, it's not too much, and you can gauge that however you want to. The interesting thing here is that the water keeps the pork from drying out, and the beans turn into almost like a pudding, and so there's like this textural thing that's going on where you get some bite from the pork and a smoothness from the beans. So here's the molasses one. I've got a little bit of pork and beans on there. That's great. That's really good. I wouldn't use the most bitter molasses that you can find. I would use something a little sweeter. This is kind of like an in-between molasses, not super sweet, but it's really good. I really enjoyed that, and I hate like barbecue beans. I've never liked them in the history of my life until right now. So that is fantastic. If I were gonna pick one or the other, I would go without the sweetener all day long, but they're both fantastic. So this Boston baked beans recipe over here, the one with the molasses, this takes us to the 1850s, and after that, we have Civil War, Industrial Revolution, all of that takes place, and by the 1890s, these are being mass produced by Heinz Company and probably some other companies as well, and they're being shipped overseas because now folks over in Europe want to taste this dish that Americans have grown to love. So it's kind of funny how that starts to work backwards than what we've been working in the 18th century, where we're bringing all this kind of food culture over from Europe. Now it's starting to shift the other way. And isn't it crazy that this dish here, the very first kind of recipe for baked beans happens, and then it's almost like you blink and they're in a can and being shipped. It's wild. And that's what happens to our world. It just keeps getting faster and faster, doesn't it?